With it getting close to Christmas, I thought that for this time of year I should reminisce on the time when Christmas TV used to be a lot more important. Nowadays the choice of festive programmes on the box isn't very good, whereas back in the good old days the selections were, well, they also usually weren't very good, but they had a significantly more captive audience, one that was completely stuffed to bursting with their Christmas lunch and capable of little more except drooling on the sofa in front of Noel's house party. Nowadays there's a lot more things to distract people while they're struggling to keep their turkey down, and the Christmas programmes on the telly are damn near as unimportant as the regular programmes are during the rest of the year. So today I have a little selection box of TV licensed games, along with one radio one, all of which we haven't actually covered a whole lot previously on the channel, aside from the odd list here and there. I mean, running a repeat of something like Supergran would be fitting enough for a video inspired by festive British television, but there's plenty more intriguing stuff out there on the old ZX Spectrum. So let's get into the 8 treats we've got here, starting with a bit of comedy. Today's video is sponsored by Wireframe, the monthly magazine that doesn't just cover the latest games, but goes inside of them. It has features on great games, both old and new, many an enlightening piece on the history of games and their creators, and it also encourages people to get into the art of game development themselves, with articles on how to recreate famous games, mechanics, and features in engines such as Unreal in their unique Toolbox section. It comes complete with beautiful, glossy artwork and opinion pieces from various key people in the industry. Oh, and me. That's what you'll find, along with a whole lot more, every month in Wireframe magazine, the magazine that lifts the lid on video games. To subscribe, visit wfmag.cc/KimJustice in the description, and I thank them for their support today. The Young Ones, gloriously anarchic, highly influential, and it never really ran a proper Christmas special, but we're still going to run with it here because the game based on The Young Ones, along with being rather abysmal, does come with a rather intriguing story behind it. The game came out in 1986, a little while after the end of the series, but with the quartet still very fresh in people's minds, and it wasn't exactly released by a name people expected. Say hello to Orpheus Software. Orpheus aren't too well known at all on micros like the Specky and C64, but they were championed by those who got behind the almighty Oric for the games they released on there. Orpheus were headed up by a man named Paul Kaufman, and they'd spun off from Tansoft, the official label for Oric games that was created by computer makers Tangerine. It was Paul who had the idea for making a game based off of The Young Ones, and to the surprise of magazines at the time, they managed to beat big names like Virgin to the license. The idea of a Young Ones game certainly did make some waves, but, well, it turned out to be a disaster. The idea behind the Young Ones game is actually quite sound. Bukowski the landlord has finally decided to kick our heroes out of their home. You pick either Rick, Neil, Vivian or Mike, and you have to collect 10 or so of the items that belong to that specific character before leaving with everybody else. The other computer characters will naturally be picking up items themselves. There's a lot of dialogue that's similar to what you would hear on the show, and you'd have to use lists to figure out exactly what items you need, along with completing some quite fiendish puzzles to get them. So far, so typical micro-adventure style title really. But the task itself is actually a huge one. There are a lot of items hidden all over the place, and it can quickly become very challenging to keep track of it all. There are more clues dotted around the game's instructions and box, which is, it has to be said, absolutely lovely looking, but the layout of the game can kind of make your head spin, the feel of the show doesn't come across too well, and most who played the game just ended up being very frustrated by it. It's pretty easy to see why when you try and get your head around it, in all honesty. An ambitious game, but one that does definitely miss the mark. That's only half of it, mind. This license did, unfortunately, end up killing Orpheus Software as a whole. How so? Well, the game ended up taking a hell of a long time to make, mostly because Paul Kaufman and the rest of the guys had to spend a lot of time in meetings with Rick Mail, Ben Elton and Lisa Mayer at just about every stage of the production. From what I can gather, mostly in comments on Zeus Dad's videos, the almighty Zeus being as close to a champion of the game as you'll find, they were very nice people, but they definitely did stick their oars in, and plenty of changes were demanded. The upshot of all of this was, of course, delays, and despite taking a big order for 10,000 copies of the game from Boots and other shops, the game fatally missed its deadline for release in Christmas of 1985. When it did get released, it was also still quite buggy, although urban legends that the game was only completable when you played as Vivian do appear to be unfounded. Orpheus never managed to get out a bug-fixed version of the game. Not long after its release, they were out of business, wrecked by the loss of money due to not getting the game out in time. Quite a shame, really. They're hardly a bad studio, and the game does show some creativity and ambition even if it ends up failing. But this can be the result of such failures, unfortunately. One other funny thing, the Young Ones also caused Your Sinclair to get into a spot of bother. During their coverage of the game, they ran a quite extensive preview of it in their second issue, including a lovely drawing of the game's house, and it also got the front cover complete with caricatures of the smelly student quartet. It appears, however, that one of the Young Ones took umbrage with their portrayal. A couple of issues later, YS ran a little blurb saying that Nigel Planer, aka Neil the hippie, and his agents had run the office and they were absolutely furious about the drawing. Hell, they might have even threatened to sue, although nothing like that actually came to fruition. It is rather funny that a comic caricature of a character in a comedy would cause such a load of bristling, it has to be said. Don Priestley. Something of a late bloomer in the world of the Specky. He was a teacher, and he was in his 40s by the time he'd got into coding thanks to night classes, a path that led him to making games for the Specky, largely through DK-tronics. You can pretty quickly tell a Priestley game by the excellent artwork. They're not the fastest movers, but they employ big sprites, dwarfing most other games. Not only that, but they're full of colour, and there's not a lot in the way of clash. He's definitely worthy of a bigger video at some point, but this is a good setting for a quick-fire Don Priestley triple bill of TV licenses. We've got a good one, a bad one, and a, well, weird one. Here's the good. Of course, it's Trapdoor. Released by Piranha in 1986, and based off the children's TV show and its strange cabal of castle monsters, you play as the almighty Burke and you perform tasks for the Finn upstairs. Generally it's another micro-style puzzling adventure where you pick up objects and use them to complete puzzles, but Trapdoor certainly stands out due to the aforementioned presentation. I mean, just look at it. Absolutely chock full of life and personality. Even if playing this might be tricky today if you're not familiar with it due to the slow speed, it was certainly something back then, selling handsomely and being put up for awards. Lovely stuff. It's not quite Priestley's best game. For me, that honour goes to his totally original and absolutely fantastic final micro title in 1989, Gregory Loses His Clock, but it's certainly going to get second place. On the bad side, here's Benny Hill's Madcap Chase. To my knowledge, this is the only game that features the behattered, surprisingly athletic and famously frugal comedian, and it's not exactly a glittering one. The game is quite simple, really. You play as Benny, and you have to pick up certain items, a lady's clothes in the first level, apples in the second, for example, and then take them back to your box with the owner in hot pursuit, dodging obstacles that change position whenever you re-enter the screen. It's, well, very simplistic, and kind of gets old after a couple of minutes, unfortunately. It's perhaps only amusing when Benny fails in his objective and gets thoroughly stomped on as a result. Don Priestley's wonderful graphics are very much in full swing at least, but I actually think he's a rather poor fit for this game. Sure, they're big sprites, and the main character is very obviously Benny Hill, but the slow speed of movement? Well, it doesn't exactly fit what the man's famous for, does it? The game promises a madcap chase and, needless to say, it does not deliver. Using an emulator, I suppose that I can ramp up the speed and create an experience that appears more accurate to the TV show, so cue a badly hummed version of Yakety Sax. Well, that certainly looks more accurate. Still doesn't make this game any good, mind you. Far too wafer thin in the gameplay department to warrant all that much attention, I'm afraid. As for the weird one, well, we've got Minder, the classic comedy drama featuring everyone's favourite choroot-chomping spiv Arthur Daly and his streetwise yet long-suffering bodyguard Terry. When I think of Minder and the ZX Spectrum, two things come to mind. There's the unclear user fake cover Crash Ran that got them into severely hot water with Sinclair user and EMAP, and this intriguing little 1985 game from Mr. Priestley. It's not the usual big sprites that he's famous for, but it is quite faithful with the licence. Appropriately enough, it's a trading game. You've got 2 weeks to make as much moolah as possible, and you do so through a whole load of nice little earners, talking to dealers and doing lots of buying and selling of items, either from casuals you meet at the Winchester Club or from the more regular dealers. Most of this is done through conversation, and there's plenty of opportunity for haggling, but it pays to keep things simple when using the text parser. Once you've completed a deal, you'll want to get Terry to collect or deliver the items, then he'll give you the cash when you next see him. You can also use him to dump goods from your lockup fast if needed, and naturally, he can be your minder and keep you company. Useful if you ever run into a spot of bother, either with some dealer who's approaching you with larcenous intent, or the ever-roaming Sergeant Chisholm who'll always want to collar you, especially if you're handling stolen goods. And naturally, most of the items you're dealing with will be very hooky indeed. It definitely pays to read the instructions with this one so that you can actually figure out what on earth to do. This sure isn't Manic Mino after all, but once you get it, it's a clever little game. You can even use appropriate slang like a fiver or a pony when you're making the dodgy deals. Some people really do love this one. It's a simple enough trader, but it's dolled up very nicely with its rogues gallery of people to talk to and various nods to the original show. It feels corny and kind of nonsensical to say that this game could be so good for you, but it's certainly worth a try. Let's turn the TV off and relax with a briar pipe and a bit of the old wireless, shall we? There aren't exactly a lot of licensed games based on radio shows full stop, but there is one for Britain's longest running soap opera, The Archers, a show on Radio 4 that has, believe it or not, been broadcast continuously since 1951. It's all nice and quaint and country life, telling the light tales of the various families of the fictional village of Ambridge. The existence of an Archer's game is a little odd in and of itself, although if this were a straighter adaptation where you just played a character and pottered around Brookfield Farm, it might not warrant much attention. This is a text adventure, after all. However, it's a text adventure by Level 9, published by Mosaic, and they take things in quite an odd direction. It appears first off as if you are indeed playing as one of the show's characters and pursuing a storyline. You can pick from one of the 4 mainstays, including Jack Woolley, Eddie Grundy, and Nelson Gabriel. You don't use the regular text parser and commands. Instead, you get a multiple choice to decide what your character does. This appears to be even simpler than usual, and you might wonder if there is all that much game here, but it soon becomes clear that actually, you're playing as the show's runner. You find this out when you receive your first memo detailing the show's current audience numbers, what they make of the current plotline, and if the characters are behaving in a believable manner or not. It is, in fact, your job to guide the show's plot and characters' actions in a way that's coherent and in the spirit of the show. So yes, directing Elizabeth Archer to snort up a line of Bisto and rob the local post office might not be the best of ideas, and will likely get you fired. It's all surprisingly meta, and pretty engrossing once you get into the idea of the game. I don't think it's that remembered nowadays at all, but it got some quite positive notes back in the day from the likes of Crash, and I can't think of too many other text-based games that are like this one. Mind you, there is another similar one that is also a classic UK TV licence, and we're going to be looking at that one next. We stick with Mosaic for the game that would prove to be their last title, but is actually one that I have always adored. Yes, Prime Minister, from 1988. In this game, you play out a week in the life of PM Jim Hacker, and the bulk of your time is spent navigating your way through various meetings based on the situations that crop up. For example, a party MP may have punched out the leader of the opposition in the Commons, and you have to figure out what to do about it. Most of your meetings will be with your humble servant and ultra-manipulative Cabinet Secretary Sir Humphrey Appleby and his ever-pedantic underling Bernard Woolley, and your dialogue choices will affect your party's standings in the polls. Ideally, you end the week better off than where you started. This is somewhat similar to The Archers in that it's a text-based game where you largely have multiple choices. No passer here. I really enjoy this game, although it probably helps if you're a fan of the show. Happily, it's one of my favourites. The game does a really good job of emulating the writings of Jonathan Lynn and Anthony Jay, and it helps that it does have something of a literary underpinning. It's based more on the books of the series rather than the programme itself, with excerpts from diary entries commenting on Hacker's decisions and several more layers added to YPM's satirical and verbose wit. Those books, taking the form of Jim Hacker's private diaries, are also highly recommended indeed, and it's a good idea for the game to take from them. If you're a fan of one of the BBC's greatest sitcoms, then you absolutely need to play this now. It still might be worth a look if you aren't, as again there's not a whole lot of micro games like it, even in the field of text. It's always good to relax at Christmas with a game show, isn't it? There's always plenty of Christmas game show specials on, chock full of people who are apparently celebrities, having fun and raising money for charity. There are of course plenty of specky versions of game shows I could choose from, not usually the flashiest bits of software, although they're generally designed for more than one person to have fun with. There's mainstays like Bob's Full House, Every Second Counts, and Blockbusters, complete with its images of Bob Holness. There's the rather basic Countdown, a game where you can just make any old thing out of the letters that you've been given and tell the computer that yes, Ingzgfal is in fact a word. If you want a whole bunch of silly faces and topical questions from the late 80s, you could have a question of sport or Mike Reed's pop quiz. Bullseye could be a good one, but unfortunately it was made by Maxon Software, the same people who made EastEnders, and therefore it most certainly is not a good one. But I would like to specifically concentrate on the computer game adaptation of 321, a show that's always guaranteed to have a big old Christmas special, complete with celebrities taking part in some silly play or whatever, a festive Dusty Bin, and the ever-present Ted Rogers. While most of the micro game show adaptations are pretty basic indeed, and this game isn't much of an exception, 321 does have quite the odd little story behind it that makes it worth looking at. The game itself is designed for 3 couples to play, and it's split into 3 parts. The first and longest one is the word association round. You pick an envelope and you get a subject, islands or car parts for example. Then a bunch of words will flash on the screen one by one, and you pick whether they're associated with that subject or not. Quite simple, really. This goes on for a couple of rounds, and then you get the second part, which is, an arcade game. yeah, it kind of takes a turn. I'm not sure exactly what you do here. Presumably 2 players crowd the keyboard and they run around a bit, jumping on the clouds and trying to avoid being hit by them. If you're hit, you lose points. That's the idea, but it's not exactly well thought through. You could just move the 2 players to the far left and right on the screen and keep them still, because those clouds are never going to touch you there, and you'll just get 999 points. So, yeah, pretty bad. The third part is the Lucky Dip round. Objects are shown to you, and you decide whether to keep them or discard them. If you discard one, it tells you that you've missed the chance to be entered in a draw for an item. This could include bad items like, of course, Dusty Bin, but the best prizes include a colour TV, a bicycle, and even a draw for a holiday for 2 in sunny Spain. There's no riddles here as there is in the original TV show. In fact, the objects bear no relation at all to what you end up getting, and in the end you're entered in a draw for whatever item you end up with. Funnily enough, this can include a lot of computer-related things, such as a micro drive, an Interface 1, a ZX Spectrum Plus, or games from the likes of New Generation and Virgin. Finally, the game ends, you're given a summary of how everyone's done, and weirdly you're then given a chance to record your results onto a blank tape. Finally, you end the game, and the tape self-destructs in 5 seconds. Or rather, we go back to basic. Even this part is weird, because it's a fake return to basic, which is something I'm not sure I've ever seen before. One last little bit of, actually kind of witty humour. So yeah, that's 321, and as you can see, it's not great. However, there's certainly some oddities. Why on earth would you need to record your results, for example? Are you actually going to load that tape up and look back on them fondly someday? Hey, remember when we played that really bad 321 Specky game? Well, there's more to this than just a plain game show adaptation, as it turns out. 321 was never sold in stores. You actually had to send off to Yorkshire Television to get the game in the post, and those prize draws in the game, they represent an entry into an actual prize draw for an actual real-life item. When you finish the game, you send off the tape you recorded and a registration card to be entered into a draw for the items that you won. The game itself had a large involvement from Cheetah. These folks were largely associated with joysticks and other peripherals, from the more famed likes of the 125 and the Bug to weird stuff like the Spectrum, Sweet Talker and the Tortoise, but they also did a few games under a label called Cheetah Soft. The game even features actual audio from Mr. Ted Rogers. This audio does play during the game, although it's easier to do this on a real Specky than it is on an emulator, seeing as it's separate audio that you would have to unplug the tape recorder's earphone connection from the Specky in order to hear properly. Thankfully, someone has preserved the audio files so that we can listen in on Ted's signature enthusiasm for a bit.
Hi everybody, I'm Ted Rogers and I'd like to invite you to an exciting new way to play 321 with me all year round. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of fun, and if you feel like laughing, applauding, or generally making a fool of yourself, well then you just go right ahead. Just as long as you don't distract your partner or your opponent. Now we're going to test your intelligence, coordination and judgment in 3 distinct phases of the game, and I'll be there to help you every step of the way. We've got all the major elements of 321 with some fabulous prizes to be won, and of course there is my old mate Dusty Bin, so don't forget.
Now you might wonder if this rather unique gimmick was successful. Certainly I don't think that any of the other game show adaptations tried to do anything like this. It doesn't seem like it was a success. 321 is a very obscure game indeed, and a Specky tape of the game was only found relatively recently when it came up for auction on eBay. A C64 version is also out there and can be seen on retrocollector.org, but to date it has not been dumped. It doesn't seem like it was advertised on the program itself, and who even knows if those prize draws ever actually took place. One more thing. Like the TV show itself, this game is actually a Spanish adaptation. This whole thing had originally been done in 1984 by Belton's Informatica for the original Spanish version of the show, Un, Dos, Tres, Respondo otra vez, prize draws, audio files and all. Perhaps that was more successful. Who knows? Another fun fact is that this game can be won on any Spectrum at all. even a 16K speccey. Considering that this 321 game was seemingly released in early 1986 or so, it has been suggested by folks like the almighty Games That Weren't that 321 is, officially, the last game ever released that could be run on a 16K ZX Spectrum in the commercial lifetime of the system. And with that, yeah, that's about all we've got here. It has to be said I certainly got an awful lot more out of this adaptation of a really terrible game show starring Ted Bloody Rogers than I ever bargained for, from a factoid point at least. Our final TV show licensed game represents the big showcase, the big Christmas episode of a drama or comedy, one that's hopefully going to garner lots of attention and have lots of people watching. Now I do suppose, seeing as the always horrifically grim festive episodes of soap operas where there's always guaranteed to be a whole load of blood, guts and death traditionally top the Christmas ratings, that I could have done EastEnders here. But no, I'm gonna leave that one because it's just plain god-awful and little else. Instead, let's have a look at Doctor Who Dalek Attack. The Doctor normally makes an appearance at Christmas after all, at least in the revived form, and this game does have some interesting facts surrounding it. Hell, a Doctor Who licensed game is somewhat intriguing seeing as surprisingly there's not a whole lot of them, and what there is generally isn't that good. Indeed, if you're aware of Dalek Attack already, you probably know that it is absolutely not a good game. Perhaps you've played this alternative software stinker on the Amiga or on the Commodore 64. Folks like Chinivision, for example, have excellent videos breaking down every version of the game and why it's worth less than a guff from K1's arse. But the ZX Spectrum version is a bit different to these ones, only slightly in the game itself, but mainly because it's an example of defiance. Or desperation, perhaps. In any case, it does represent something of a rage against the dying of the light, as we shall explain. The game itself is rather generic. Obviously, you play as the Doctor. While the original BBC series had been cancelled a few years prior to this game, the Doctor in question is still the seventh one, that being Sylvester McCoy. The game itself is a mazy platformer where you have to explore each level and rescue the trapped humans that the Daleks, Ogrons and other monsters are using for food. You do so in various locations from London to Paris, New York, Tokyo, and ultimately the Daleks' home planet of Skaro where you'll have a final battle with Davros. The Spectrum game is a bit stripped down from other versions. There's no opening level where you ride a hoverboard through the sewers, and a whole bunch of other enemies are missing. You only get Daleks, Ogrons and Robomen, and the Doctor uses his sonic screwdriver as a weapon, although it's not much more than a pea shooter. The game isn't that offensive, it doesn't control badly, it moves quickly, and the graphics aren't awful, although they are naturally monochrome. Hell, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's the worst version of a generally piss-poor game. But yeah, it's not exactly special at all, and it didn't warrant much in the way of good ratings. With all that said, it was a bit of a surprise that the game actually came out for the Spectrum in the first place, as we're just about to detail. So the majority of versions of Dalek Attack came out in and around the autumn of 1992, and a ZX Spectrum version was advertised for around then. However, this version of it was delayed, and news of it seemed to dry up as we got further into 1993. In the May 93 issue of Your Sinclair, it was revealed that the Specky version had finally been finished, but Alternative didn't think it was worth releasing it. YS weren't too happy about this, and they implored their readers to fill in a form and send it to them to show their interest as part of a campaign called Save Our Specky, something they'd done previously to secure the Specky release of Nigel Mansell's World Championship from Gremlin. And yeah, the campaign worked. The next issue saw YS bring the good news that Alternative had decided to put Dalek Attack out after all, and the July issue saw them review it. Still, even after putting so much energy behind getting the game out, Your Sinclair could only muster up a score of 56% for it because, well, as previously mentioned, it wasn't all that good. But with all this in mind, seeing as it came out so late and that it was the last new game that YS ever reviewed, it's probably safe to say that Doctor Who Dalek Attack is, drumroll please, the last full-price ZX Spectrum game released in its commercial lifetime. This game was, indeed, the very end. Of a sort, anyway. The campaign also mentions alternative dithering over whether to release a specky version of their Alvin and the Chipmunks game that was also slated to come out on the Amiga, C64 and Amstrad, but in the end this one didn't come out. Mind you, that one didn't end up coming out for any platform at all, despite apparently being completed. Alternative are, of course, one of the few independent micro games companies from their era who are still kicking around today, so one wonders if any details on that title remain in their archives. But the effort of your Sinclair to successfully convince them of the virtues of releasing Dalek Attack on the Spectrum does deserve a bit of respect, because even if the game didn't turn out to be that good, it would have just disappeared into the ether if they hadn't tried to give something to those who were still standing by their specky in the middle of 1993. And that's about it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this look at some specky UK TV show licenses. There should at least be some interesting stuff to look at here, even if a few of the games aren't exactly brimming with quality. Obviously there are plenty more titles I could feature here, because there is no end of strange and ridiculous licensed games available for this platform and others. But hopefully this little selection box has lined your stomach up nicely over this festive period. Thank you very much for watching, hopefully you've enjoyed it, and in the immortal words of the First Doctor, a happy Christmas to all of you at home. Bye for now.